Hi, this is Dr. Richard Shuster, host of the Daily Helping Podcast and CEO of Mars Industries. Today, we're going to talk about how a tragic moment can transform your life, overcoming fear, and using tools to radically transform your life and how to be more successful in the corporate world.
Congratulations! You are tuned into Dov Baron's Leadership and Loyalty Show, the #1 podcast for Fortune 500 executives and those who are dedicated to creating a quantum leap in leadership. Your host, Dov Baron, is the founder of FullMontyLeadership.com. He's an executive mentor to leaders like you, a contributing writer for Entrepreneur Magazine, CEO World, and he's been featured on CNN, Fox, CBS, and many other notable sites. Dov Baron is an international business speaker who was named by Inc. magazine as one of the top 100 leadership speakers to hire. Now, over to Dov Baron.
Welcome, dear friends, fans, and fellow aficionados of leadership excellence. Thank you for joining us on this episode of Dov Baron's Leadership and Loyalty Tips for Executives, a FullMonty interview series. I'm your host, Dov Baron. I'm the founder of FullMonty Leadership, and I'm here to assist you tapping into the one thing in your business changes everything. Let me ask you, are you committed to up-leveling your leadership? Let me ask you this, what will it take to get you off the hamster wheel of more and more and moving into creating a real legacy? Let's find out. Well, remember, you can chat about this episode or any past episodes on our Facebook page. Just look for Leadership and Loyalty Podcast. If you're a new listener, new viewer, thank you for joining us. Strap yourself in. We're about to go full Monty. As always, you can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, or wherever you tune into podcasts. And we always need your help in staying relevant, so please go there, rate, review, and subscribe to the channel. You can also catch us on traditional radio stations across the United States every Monday and Thursday. We're all the way from Florida to Wisconsin to Quantico in Washington, D.C. You can also look for us on Roku TV, where there's over 100,000 subscribers. If you're a regular listener, big thank you to you for making us the #1 podcast globally for Fortune 500 listeners, with a potential reach of 2.5 to 4 million listeners for every single show. We are honored and grateful to be cited by Inc.com as the #1 podcast to make you a better leader. You know, you can also catch us on Spotify, Google Home, Alexa. Simply say, play Dov Baron Podcast. Again, thank you for sharing the show with everybody you know. All right, let's strip it down, dive right in. As a leader, whether you're a CEO, someone in the C-suite, a sales leader, an entrepreneur, or leader in any capacity, you know the demands on leaders today have not gone down. They've gone up in every possible way. You may feel like you can't stop running on that hamster wheel because everyone else might catch up. And if they do, then what? Well, what if you suddenly hit a hard stop? What would you do? What would you be remembered for? Would you be able to cope? Well, let's find out together. My guest on this episode is Dr. Richard Shuster. Dr. Richard Shuster is a clinical psychologist. He is a keynote speaker, CEO of Mars Industries, and the host of the Daily Helping with Dr. Richard Shuster. The food for the brain, knowledge from the experts, tools to win at life, which is regularly downloaded in over 100 countries, to which I was recently honored to be a guest. His mission is to help people become the best versions of themselves and as a result, make the world a better place. He's a sought after media expert. Dr. Richard Shuster's expertise podcasts have also been featured in many publications, including the Huffington Post, NBC News, Glassdoor, Men's Health, Cosmopolitan, and many others. Please help me welcome the man who really is from Mars, Dr. Richard!
Take me to your leader. Oh, it's so good to be here, Dov. Thanks for having me on the show.
You're very welcome, mate. It's good to have you here. I appreciate you taking the time to be with us.
Absolutely.
Listen, I like to start the show with a question that I think is an important one, because we live in a very highly influenced world, and we're often, we're told who to be influenced by. But I find that very often leaders are influenced by somebody that we likely wouldn't know or even suspect. Who is someone that we likely wouldn't know or wouldn't suspect who's been a major influence in your life?
Definitely my first employer, my first boss when I graduated from college. His name was Milton, and he is the prototypical full metal jacket drill sergeant kind of a guy. He was an ex-Marine, and
Wow.
when I got out of college at the age of 23 and he hired me into a sales role, I knew nothing about sales. I knew nothing about leadership, and the very first thing he did was drop a stack of books on my shelf on my desk, including the West Point Way of Leadership was, I think, the first book he had me read, and Think and Grow Rich, and a whole bunch of these books that were never on my radar. And that really began a journey for me of personal and professional development. And I credit him with a lot of that. It was over 20 years ago.
Wow, that's very cool. And he was an ex-Marine.
Yep.
Is there one of those books that he drops on you that really stands out for you? Was it the West Point one, or was it?
That's really the one that it was, because a lot of the concepts like in Think and Grow Rich, and some of the Robert Kiyosaki stuff, and some of these other classic sales books that everybody kind of reads, Zig Ziglar and such, like those concepts were pretty relatable to me in a lot of ways, and I think they are to most people. But really looking at things from a military standpoint, in which I had no framework, was really good for me, because it gave me perspectives I didn't have.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? It's one of the things I love about that question is that the person who usually had influence is usually somebody who comes at the world from a very different place than we do. And people say, well, it was my mom, it was my dad, and of course I understand that, but it's the one that's really got the punch is often the one that just is like, really? That person? That's so cool. Yeah, that's great. Now, you and I have a couple of things in common. Aside from a background in psychology, we've both been across the veil, one might say.
Yes.
As most of my listeners know, I fell off a mountain and got smashed to pieces. I had my fall. You had your fall too. Tell us a little bit about your fall. Although yours wasn't off a mountain.
It wasn't off a mountain, but it still changed the entire trajectory of my life. Prior to that happening, and my car accident, which I'll talk about in a second, I was in the process of building an IT company, and I, at a very young age, had bid on and miraculously won a contract with the Department of Defense. It wasn't building weapons. This was 100% software related, but in that moment, something kind of flipped for me, and not in a good way. I became kind of like, in my mind, I was going to be the next Tony Stark, but before anybody knew who Tony Stark was, I would get on eBay and start looking at yachts and private islands and things that I felt I was destined to have, because I needed to have these things to be successful. Didn't want a family, didn't want kids, didn't want to get married. I just wanted to accumulate mass like Scrooge McDuck and be known as this empire building machine. And on what was otherwise an ordinary Saturday, I was driving to dinner.
Pause you for a sec.
Yeah.
How old were you at that point?
24, maybe.
So 24, you're on eBay, you're looking at yachts, you're looking at islands, thinking this is the trajectory of my life. You've got a contract with the Department of Defense. So from that perspective, anybody sort of looking in on the side would go, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I was kind of like the character that Nicolas Cage played in the movie Family Man before he woke up and had a family. I mean, I was just so focused on empire building. And then while driving off to have dinner with a cousin, I was in a near fatal accident, and I broke my spine. I had severe internal injuries, nearly tore every ligament in my neck, and I was sure I was about to die. In fact, the brain is very interesting. There's a lot of neuroscience and research that we have information going back to soldiers from World War I who, you hear this analogy, right, of life flashing before your eyes. That's not really what happens to a lot of people that see themselves as about to die. What time does is time slows you down, almost like Neo in the Matrix, to kind of give you a chance to get your wits about you. So from the moment of time where I made that left-hand turn into an intersection, and then I realized that this car was screaming at me at full speed, and then that car slams into me, I'm sent into oncoming traffic, another car hits me, sends me the other way, and ultimately my momentum is stopped by a telephone pole, which crushes the driver's side of my car. Maybe 3 seconds elapsed. And yet that for me might as well have been an eternity. I'm literally having this full on discussion with myself in slow motion. And I'm thinking, I'm about to die. And it wasn't one of these, oh, dear Lord, if you please let me live, I'm tomorrow going to start giving presents to orphan boys or girls. It wasn't like that. I knew that I was dead. And then I became overwhelmed with shame, Dove. I started thinking about this call that, again, I was young. My parents were going to get this call that their son is dead. They were out to dinner with friends. I knew that. And then I started thinking about all of these things that I've been putting so much energy on, the nice watch, the nice car, and, trips to Europe and blowing money on stupid stuff. And I'm just like, this isn't what matters. And I'm literally having this conversation as I'm seeing my center console crush into my side like it's an empty can of pop or soda, depending on what part of the country you're listening from. I'm watching like shards of my windshield floating in the air, and the light from the setting sun reflecting on all this. And I'm just like, this is not a life that I'm proud of. And so, spoiler alert, I didn't die. But like you, I found myself having to convalesce and recover, and that gave me an opportunity to start thinking about how do I change my life and do something that's more meaningful.
So this is a really important point that I think is so often missed. We see these moments, you talk about the slow motion experience, and people do think it's like, come to the light, or, like you and I talked about when I was on your show. And it's not always what people project from the movies. But I'm really interested in this moment you talked about, this moment of shame, this moment of realizing, what the heck, I'm living my life based on a pretty watch or a trip and things I can show off. Do you think that was there? Do you think that you were conscious of that before, but shoved it down every time it popped up and it just came right to the surface in that event? Or do you think it never even crossed your mind until that event?
I think what it did, it sparked something that's been there, in the sense that, they made all of us in high school do this vocational testing, right? Like the guidance counselor comes and we fill out this inventory about what we should be when we grow up, right, in the real world. Yeah. And mine said I should be a therapist or a psychologist, and so I kind of chuckled about that, but when I was in college, everybody had something to offer me, because it wasn't agenda driven. It wasn't money driven. It was just about getting to know people. I just think the hunt for money and this idea of having to succeed on a ridiculous level just kind of trumped everything for me in terms of what my focus was on. And that accident was the beginning of kind of rebooting my system and focusing on what's more important, because I had the lessons growing up on what was important. And my mother was a school teacher, and until I was born, and then she didn't have to work anymore. And my dad was a dentist in private practice, but my dad would give dentistry away for families that couldn't afford it, and made a point to share that with me and my brother. And so I had those good role models growing up. I just kind of pushed all that down for the purpose of focusing on money for a time.
How long were you in recovery?
It was 8+ months of traction and physical therapy, and it was a disaster.
Your spine was broken, right?
Yeah, I broke my back. Yep, I broke my back. The ligaments took a long time to heal.
Did they think you weren't going to walk?
I was given a list of things I would never do again, and kind of laughed in the doctor's face. I was like, you don't know me very well. I don't like to be told I can't do something. So I think there was part of that impetus to prove them wrong. But I got very, very lucky, Dove, in terms of where that fracture point happened. If, for those of you listening and you break your back, try and break it at T5. That's kind of, that's where the money's at, because a couple inches higher and I would have been paralyzed from the neck down, and a couple inches lower and I would have been paralyzed. I would have, what did they say? Paralyzed from the neck down. A couple inches lower, I would have been paralyzed from the waist down. That's what they had told me. So I got extraordinarily lucky in terms of where that fracture point was. A little bit shorter, which isn't a great thing, but now today, all these years later, I can do pretty much everything that I've always wanted to do, including all those things they told me I'd never do again. So
Yeah.
pretty grateful about that.
Yeah, I can certainly relate to that. Yeah, all the things I couldn't do. Yeah, really? I think not. So you were 8 months in recovery. You did all your traction. You did all those kinds of things.
Mm-hmm.
Then the journey begins. Okay, so now you've gone from being this software guy with this big contract. What happened to the business? You know, because we got leaders and business people here listening to this, and they go, you know, I was talking about, well, what happened? You know, in the intro, I talked about what happens if it suddenly comes to a stop.
Right.
You came to a very dramatic stop. What happened to business? What happened to leadership during that time?
So I was the face of our company. And so for me, it was interesting because it kind of like Animal House, right? Like the devil and the angel on the shoulders. So there was a very strong voice telling me that the work that I was doing is not the work I'm supposed to be doing. And even though I knew that, fear was controlling me in a lot of ways. And what I mean by that is I knew that this wasn't fulfilling for me. Like I go back to work and I resumed my old role, but everything was kind of like a shade of gray. Like I wasn't getting excited about it. I knew I was in the wrong place, but I told everybody in the world what I was doing that I knew. And I had friends and family rooting me on. And I think I was scared of letting them down. In fact, I know I was scared of letting them down. So I stuck it out far longer than I should have. I actually stuck it out in that company for 2 years because of fear and feeling increasingly miserable day after day after day until finally the pain was great enough emotionally for me to say, I just can't do this anymore. In fact, you know, we know from a scientific standpoint, right? Fear, if the fear of something isn't enough to induce change, you emotionally have to feel pain to the degree where you will make a modification to a behavior. And so at that point, I walked away and I had been doing the 80 hours a week thing for a couple of years and just walked away and told my partners I was out. And then didn't have any idea what I was going to do next, but knew for my own sake I had to get out, and that's what I did.
You know, it's interesting because you have come to exactly the point that I think is so vital, because you know I know in your work as a clinical psychologist, with what you know and what I know for our own experiences, is that everybody thinks it's that moment that turns your life around. It's that moment when you get hit by the car, you see the slow motion, you fall off the mountain, you're smashed to pieces. But it's not. It's never, in my experience, it's never that. And I've watched, and I'm interested to know if you've noticed this, that people will have these devastating events and swear they understand, they know they've got to change, but they don't. And, you know, like you said, 2 years of going back and operating out of fear and guilt and all the other stuff. And for me, I'm coming back. I'm going to come, I'm not going to, it's all bullshit, but we can't step off that wheel. And it makes us almost embed ourselves deeper into it until we just become so completely miserable. And as you said, the emotional pain has to become far greater than the physical pain. And then we go, okay, I'm out. The towel's in.
A great way of thinking about that is if somebody wants to lose weight, they pop on a scale and it's 15 pounds heavier than they want to be. Cognitively, they absolutely know they need to lose weight, but then they might just go get on their couch and start binging Netflix and eating ice cream, right? So it's that emotional disconnect. Without that emotional pain, we are not going to move forward, even though we know we need to.
Yeah. People like to think that they are motivated by pleasure, but we are not. We are not motivated by pleasure. We are motivated by pain. Pleasure does motivate us, but very short term. Long term change takes place with the emotional pain. And the problem is that we are a comfort centric society. We're always looking for what will make us comfortable, but our growth only comes in our pain. And so instead of running away from it, we actually need to embrace it so that we don't have to manifest it. If we psychologically embraced it, then maybe we don't have to have car accidents and fall off mountains and do dumb shit.
Well, but your point is exactly right, Dov, because if you think about comfortable comfortable is another word for homeostasis. And
Absolutely.
the brain is wired to keep us in a state of homeostasis in all aspects of our life.
Yes. Yeah. Same and safe are exactly the same thing to the brain. So so there's a journey there. So you've gone from being that guy, the software guy, doing very well. You've had the car accident. There's a couple of years sort of in transition there, miserable, but still doing the same work. Is that when you then moved into the place where your careers counselor said you should go, which is a therapist, or is there something, what's going on there after that?
It's interesting. I like the term accidentally on purpose. And what happened to me was really interesting. So I had walked away from the business and spent the next probably 3 months in a pretty dark place. I was kind of wallowing in these poor decisions I made, investing all this time and money, learning the technology, and now I have this useless set of skills that I was pretty sure I would never use again. And I often state when I go on programs, if Instacart had existed back then, I don't know what my life would be like today, because the only thing I really had to leave my place for was groceries. And so I went to the grocery store and I heard two women talking, and they were very concerned about their teenage daughters on myspace.com. So they should tell you how long ago that was. And one of the girls' daughters was in a bikini, and the other one said, and she was doing this, making a strange face. And so I interjected myself in that conversation. And I said to them, hey, I have a background in technology. Here are the things you need to be aware of to keep your family safe. And while I was actually trying to give them some advice, their eyes got really big like silver dollar pancakes, and they were freaking out because now I've terrified them about internet safety. And they said, hey, will you come talk to our PTA? And I wasn't doing anything at the time other than just wallowing in my own self-pity. So I went. And so I'm speaking in front of people, which was exciting to me. And there was a guy in the audience. I don't know why they didn't ask this guy to talk to the PTA, but he was on that city's cybercrime unit. He was a police officer. And he came up to me after and he said, you're a really good speaker. You have really good information. And you as a civilian can say things that, that being in law enforcement, I can't say. And now I'm teaming up with them. And so now I'm speaking all over the place, talking about internet safety. And I had that little spark. And this is kind of what that shift was. I've now started reframing what I was viewing as, a deficit and wasted time as an opportunity to help people. And it felt really good. And in doing that, I was asked at one of these schools I spoke at if I would mentor, because there were lots of female mentors, but there were no male mentors. And mentoring is basically like therapy, but it's not like there's no rules. You just hang with a kid. And it was really exciting to be part of the change process for this kid. I would never be so arrogant to say just because he was with me, I turned his life around, but I was certainly a part of that process. Sure. And that was very exciting. And because of that, I made the decision to seek out graduate education, got a master's in social work, worked with Katrina victims while I was doing that training, which was incredibly powerful, and then went on to get my doctorate with subspecialties in advanced training in forensic and neuropsychology. But it was that really out of that conversation at the grocery store that sparked a lot of the path that I moved forward on.
I just love that. Now, what do you think blocked you? Because I think that many of us who are successful, we can all see that there are things that blocked us from reaching our success, a real success, maybe fulfillment for a long time. Do you recognize what yours was, what it was that was blocking you?
For sure, it was fear. It was fear, and the fear impacted me in a lot of ways. It not only kept me from doing things, but there was fear of failure for me. There was fear of the unknown for me. So I was dealing with levels of fear, different levels of fear. And once I finally, mustered the courage to start doing some things and again, got those groceries, I started getting some positive feedback from my environment that, hey, maybe I didn't waste my time and maybe I can do something that is kind of more in line with who I think I'm supposed to be now. And that was really that transformation point for me.
Now, you had said that when you were the young, hip software guy running around like a loony and doing all your stuff,
Yeah.
no interest in family, no
No,
interest in getting married and having kids, but you did. You eventually did get married, right?
I sure did.
And you also had a son.
Yep. I have two boys now, 6 and 4, and I've been married 10 years this September, which is pretty
10
cool.
years. But life was not done with dealing out some cards that would shake up your world a little bit. So tell us a little bit about that. What happened next?
Yeah, so kind of jumping forward in the story, this is in 2012 when I'm in my residency. So I've already completed my formal graduate training, and then to become the doctor, I had to do my postdoctoral residency, which I was doing in neuropsychology in Miami, Florida at the time. And I received a call out of the blue in which it was one of my wife's coworkers, and she worked across town from where I was training. And they said that she's collapsed. This was at about 31 weeks of her pregnancy, unable to move, unbelievable pain, and she needed to get rushed to the hospital, which is what happened. And so the irony of this, a little bit of knowledge is dangerous. And so I'm actually working a lot with pediatrics at that point in my residency, and my wife is a pediatric occupational therapist. So all that she and I basically see are the worst case scenarios
Of course.
for kids neurodevelopmentally every single day. And so I know what the outcome measures are at a child born at 31 weeks, and they're not pretty at all. And so I get to the hospital, and by the time I could get across town, they had already done all of their routine tests on her. And so the doctor comes out, and he was white as a ghost. And so, wow. You don't have to be an expert to read his body language. And I knew we were about to get some bad news. And he says, I have good news and bad news, which is even worse than bad news, right? Like he's buttering you up for something really bad. So this is what he said. The good news is the reason why you're in so much pain, as he's talking to my wife, is because your son was kicking your sciatic nerve. Now, that's extraordinarily painful for anybody that's had sciatic nerve pain, but it doesn't present any sort of imminent danger to a mother or child.
No.
But here's what he said to follow that up, and this is why he looked the way that he did, and he fumbled through these words. He said, what we discovered in doing our tests is that you've had a small hole in your cervix, like a pinhole size, imperceptible hole that my wife had in her cervix, and she had been leaking amniotic fluid kind of insidiously and unbeknownst to us throughout the entire pregnancy. And what he told us was that had you not come in today, your son would have suffocated to death in utero within the next 12 hours.
Wow.
And so we've got chills, we're starting to well up with tears because we know what's going to happen next potentially. And so what they tell us is they're going to stick an IV in my wife and try and pump fluids into her and get the levels up. And if they can't get the levels up in a certain amount of time, they're going to cut them out right away. And so I'm sent home to build a crib, which is not in my wheelhouse of strengths. And I'm looking at this box that says 2-man job. It's got like the cartoon like silhouettes of these two people lifting this giant thing. And it was like an episode of the Three Stooges. I'm up all night. It keeps falling over. I'm trying to do this by myself. I'm in the midst of just freaking out about what's going on. And somehow I got it built, and I got back to the hospital at 5 a.m. And the levels had gone up just enough that they were going to give us 12 more hours, and just enough. And so that became 6 weeks where she was on bed rest for the rest of the pregnancy. And basically my life was nothing but running back and forth from Costco, buying cases of Gatorade for her just to chug. But we kept him in there, and he cooked. So that was the good news. The bad news, while he had enough fluid to live, he didn't have enough fluid to swim around and do all the things that babies are supposed to do when they're in utero. And so his head was wedged under my wife's rib cage. And if you would crank your head all the way to the left to the point where it hurts, and imagine being stuck that way for 6 weeks, that's where he was. And while that doesn't sound like a big deal, when he was born at 37 weeks, his head was misshapen because of the rib cage thing. In addition to the fact that he didn't know he had a right side of his body for the first 8 months of his life. And
wow.
Yeah. And so my son had all of these issues because from a sensory modality standpoint, everything is connected. Crawling, touch, the growth, the fine motor, the growth, it all connects. So if you can't turn your head to the middle and you can't recognize that you have this part of the body, it affects all kinds of development. And so we were living in Florida at the time, and there was a particular program, and I believe all states have some flavor of this, but this particular program, if your kid was under 2 years old and had a number of these issues, then you'd get some free assistance. And so at the time, I'm making a big I'm working back, as a resident, making my like 60, 80 hours a week, and I was making 36 grand a year. And so, money was certainly an issue for us. And so we go and we apply for this program, and they send somebody out to the house to look at our kid. And part of what they're testing, so they're testing for motor skills, they're testing for cognitive skills. So because my wife is very intelligent, he gets all his brains and his looks from her. And so his aggregate scores were too high. And so we didn't qualify for all the assistance that he needed. And so, but we knew he needed it. And so we didn't have people to rely on. And we did this ourselves, had to buy him a helmet to fix his misshapen head. That was $8 grand on a credit card. And he needed speech, physical, and occupational therapy and credit card. And we just kept taking out more lines of credit to get him the help that he needed. And at the time, we basically destroyed ourselves financially to help our son. Now, I think any parent listening to this would do the same thing for their kid. And I would do it 100 out of 100 times. I would do the exact same thing. But it was one of those things where we had some knowledge, we were in the profession, and we knew what kind of things that my son needed to improve. And I'm very grateful to say that now he's all of these treatments we got him helped him. And if you saw him today, he's perfect. And of course, I'm saying that as a biased dad, but I mean, he can do everything any other kid can do. He can swing on monkey bars, and he can run, and he does all of these things. And cognitively, he's very bright and he's beautiful. And so I was just so grateful to be in that place, and that we got him the help he needed. And so as my podcast took off, and I had the privilege of interviewing Bob Berg, who remains one of my favorite interviews, the Go-Giver. After that episode was over, this was early on. So Bob was my first big get at the time, right? He was my biggest guest on the show by far at the time when I had him. And so I was still a little bit.
Good man.
Oh, he's amazing. And I was still a little bit.
Up for about 20 years.
Yeah, he's so good. And not only is he good in terms of what he does, but what he believes in and the way that he helps people. And so yeah, I think I was maybe 15 or 20 episodes into my show, and I was still a little self-conscious, and I was asking my guests, how do you think that went? Did that go okay? And he said to me, I'm going to tell you something, Richard, I've been doing this for a really long time, and you're exceptionally gifted as an interviewer. And if you keep doing the work you're doing, you're going to help a lot of people. And I was so excited about that. Like I ran upstairs and like busted in the bedroom door. This was a night podcast interview, and just screamed to my wife, Bob Berg thinks I'm great. And so I was just like on this rambling stream of excitement. And I said, in the podcast, I think it's going to be successful. And won't it be awesome when we have all this money from it that I can take 10 grand and give it back to our son's preschool and have them earmark that money for kids just like him that need speech, PT, and OT. And I got chills, and like the little car tube light bulb goes off over my head. I couldn't even finish the statement. I ran downstairs, literally ran, got back on my computer, went to GoDaddy, and I typed in "Every Kid Rocks," and the domain was available. And then I immediately sent an email to my attorney and said, hey, I want to start a nonprofit for kids that just need a push to reach their potential, and we can give schools money for speech, PT, and OT. And he said, okay. And we got our 501c3 status about 8 months later. And so now, again, because of the podcast and the audience and the reach that I have, I'm able to promote this charity nationwide that helps kids everywhere. And I'm so grateful to be doing that. So my wife is on the board with that. It's the only place where I actually get to be my wife's boss. But it is so much fun and so gratifying for me to be in this place where I really get to use what was a horrible period of our lives and help other people so that parents don't have to go through what we went through.
But again, another example of something extraordinarily painful catalyzing something extraordinarily beautiful and a massive positive change. So that is very, very cool. And of course, that, I guess in many ways that has become it is becoming and continues to become your legacy. legacy, in my work, I believe is extraordinarily important. I talk a lot about legacy, and I know that that's something that matters a lot to you.
It does.
Talk to us about why you believe legacy matters so much.
I think one of the things that's important to instill in the people that we're closest with is that we're leaving an impact. And this doesn't just extend to our family, but it also extends to our workplace, right? And so, speaking as a parent, I can speak to this in a couple of levels. Speaking as a parent, I had my kids a little bit later in life. And so even though my 6-year-old has already informed me, and I don't know where this came from, that he's taking over my podcast when I'm an old man, it is really important for me to let my boys know, one, that the work I'm doing is important and making a difference in the lives of others. 2, it provides financial freedom, which is very important, and we should all strive for financial freedom under that umbrella. But most importantly, that we live our lives on our terms. And so my kids go to a school, and I'm very grateful that they get to go to the school that they do. But I'm usually the only dad who shows up for their activities. And so having the freedom, the time freedom, to be able to build my podcast interviews and my speaking engagements and all of the things that I do around my children's schedule, being able to schedule time every single week to go on dates with my wife during the day is really special. And so, when my kids are older, they're young now, but one day, and the internet is forever, right? Good and bad. One day my kids are going to go and start Googling me. And when they're older and able to understand some of the work that I'm doing, they're going to see that I did good stuff and I did it my way and on my terms. And I think that's important from a family standpoint. I think building a corporate culture where you're creating something that's going to exist beyond your time with that organization, and that organization has the right leadership in place to have a mission that helps people is essential. And I do believe we're waking to that more and more. I do believe that there has been a massive shift in the last 20 years that is becoming increasingly important. But legacy matters. And I think if you're not thinking about your legacy, you're really not thinking about where you're going.
Absolutely. And I know, you mentioned a few minutes back, Bob Berg, and his all the work he's doing around kindness, and I know that's an important thing for you around the acts of kindness.
Yes.
How are you bringing that forward? How are you bringing that to the world of leadership?
So part of what I do is I do this through my show, and my show's mission is to help people become the best versions of themselves. But that's an aspirational goal, right? Like, Dove, you're not getting a certificate from me in the mail 3 weeks from now congratulating you on being the best Dove Baron that you're ever going to be. We're always...
Oh, come on now.
You gotta work a little bit harder, man.
I was waiting for that. I've been twiddling my thumb since we met.
I know,
waiting
right?
For it to arrive. I just thought it was coming in slow mail.
I might get you another certificate, but it's not going to be that one. But so, right, like that's aspirational. And so what I built into my show is a little bit of neuroscience. In our show's movement is to encourage the listener to commit acts of kindness every day. And you can do this in your workplace. You can do this in your family life. You can do this as you're buying groceries. Because here's the thing. We are, and there's so much research to back this up, we are neurobiologically hardwired to feel good when we help other people.
Yeah.
And yet society has us focused on this thing, right? Selfies and self-aggrandizing stuff. And I kind of got turned on to this when I did my doctoral dissertation on the impact that technology has on personality functioning, and narcissism in particular was what I really looked at. And so if I took 2 people in your audience listening to this, and I hooked both of them up to real-time diagnostic imaging so we could see their brainwave patterns in real time, and one of them was handed $1,000, that's person A. Subject A, will be scientists here, and subject B handed $1,000 to some other random person, the same structures in our brains are lighting up. And so with my show's call to action, it's to encourage people to commit acts of kindness and do it every day and post it in their social media feeds using the hashtag #MyDailyHelping. And you know this about habituation. If you get somebody in the habit of doing something day after day after day, we create those neural pathways, and that becomes a part of what we're doing. And so if you're doing something that's truly from a place of selflessness and giving to others, you are going to feel good every day, and you're going to have those good hormones released into your body, like dopamine and oxytocin, that are so important, and that we often miss that when we are stressed out and when we're dealing with deadlines and whatnot. So, I mean, they've actually done a ton of research in the corporate world that employees that have higher levels of oxytocin do better in terms of teams. Employees miss fewer days of work for illness. Like, there's just no downside to this. So it's something that should be incorporated into everybody's lives.
Yeah, it's easy. I mean, we are a society that has been trained to believe it's about getting.
Right.
But that's a social conditioning. Whereas biologically, neurologically, we actually program to give, not receive. And that is, I think that's easily forgotten in a world where we are driven by that cell phone. It's quite fascinating to look at. You, when we think about you now, we talked about, you started out as a software guy, you got your big contract, there was the car crash, there was the recovery, there's the meeting the ladies in the grocery store, then there's advising around safety and the internet. That transferred then into you actually going on and studying and becoming Dr. Richard, and you get your psychology PhD, neurosciences, etc. But it's interesting because you've taken it full circle, because now we've come all the way back into software.
Yes.
It was about superpowers and your tying of software to your clinical psychology and all of the neuroscience. So tell us about where that journey has taken you and us.
There's a massive irony to that, right? Like I'm back in this world that I never thought I'd be in again all these years later. And so during the period of time when I was a clinician, and all that I did post-licensure was assessment. I didn't do the therapy. I simply would do neuropsychological assessments and forensic assessments, and there was a part of me that felt extremely incongruent. And what I meant by that is I would have a patient sitting across from me, and I would give them a psychological assessment tool. And I knew full well that in many instances, even though I was using the quote unquote gold standard for the industry, that the assessment sucked. Or if it didn't suck, at best, it was so pejorative because the industry was built upon insurance codes, and you have to have this certain level of problematic issues in your life in order to get a code and get reimbursed. And it was all about cash. It was all about cash. I felt that the industry, a $7 billion industry, was extraordinarily uninclusive. It was restrictive. And so I decided I wanted to build a better mousetrap. And so I saw
let's just give everybody context here for a minute. So psychological assessments, if you work for a corporation, there's a pretty good chance you've been through one like the Myers-Briggs or something similar.
Or the DISC or something along those lines. Absolutely.
Yeah. So just so that everybody understands what we're talking about, it's one of those tests that you've been through that you were leading people through and feeling like this is missing so much. It's so limiting. And as you said, it's driven by money rather than actually helping.
That's right. And so I looked at that industry and I said I wanted to do something different. And so my business partner and I, who was actually a colleague that went through graduate school with me, we assembled a team of researchers. So we had Fortune 500 consultants, and we had neuroscience, and we had all of these experts from these different areas. And what we started doing was ripping apart all of the instruments that were well known, like I said, the DISC and the Strengths Finders and the VIA and Myers-Briggs. And I'm not here disparaging any of those instruments.
No.
But what we wanted to do was build something that was different. And so what we looked at with one of our instruments, and we have several that serve very different verticals. We have a PTSD one for veterans, and we have certain ones for athletes, and we have ones for addiction and recovery, although EAP programs have been excited about that one. But the one that I think is the most interesting for leaders in business is called POWERS, which stands for the Predictor of World-Class Excellence Rating Scales. And what we did was we examined 21 dimensions, and these 21 dimensions roll up into 7 main categories that are empirically associated with success and life. And notice I didn't just say success in the workplace, although this is certainly a part of it, but success in life. And I was at an event a number of months ago where I heard Garrett Gunderson speaking, and he talked about a study that was done on Fortune 1000 CEOs. I believe it was by Forbes. And they looked at a number of dimensions that the CEOs had, including things such as relationships with their children, physical health, their marriages, and overwhelmingly, the large number of these people interviewed who most would view, like you think in Western society, who are the pinnacles of success in the corporate world, you're talking about these C-suite people for Fortune 500 companies, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And overwhelmingly, a large number of them had failed marriages, felt that they spent their entire careers working far too many hours and had strained relationships with their kids. Many of them were in exceptionally poor physical health. And so just knowing your strengths, just knowing what you're great at isn't enough. It's addressing and balancing all these different dimensions in your life, including work-life equilibrium, including introspective intelligence and interpersonal intelligence. So we dug down into the research and were able to design algorithmically a system that an individual could take our assessment in around 15 minutes, and algorithmically it would determine where they stand on these 21 dimensions associated with success. And this was really designed, certainly an individual can take it, and a lot of individuals do, but it was really designed for the corporate world to have a tool and address things that are so critical in 2019. Now, Gary Vaynerchuk recently said that your weakest link is the emotional intelligence or the worst emotional intelligence in one of your employees. So if you have somebody who's a phenomenal salesperson and he's your sales leader, but he's poor on emotional intelligence, that is going to be the weakest link in your organization. So we take a look at these elements that science is starting to tell us are so critical regarding emotional intelligence. We take a look at one's understanding of cultural intelligence and how that impacts the work life, as well as dimensions of leadership and physical wellness and one's ability to tolerate stress. And so we go through this and walk the test taker through. They get a 12-page document at the end of that tells them where they stand in comparison to other people their age. And we're very proud of it. It's probably one of the most exciting things I've ever done. And what's ironic is that particularly with the work we're doing with the DoD, it is interesting that I have that background of government contracting that I never thought I would use again, but it's all kind of come full circle. And so we've created these instruments that are accessible for everybody, and we've got more coming, but I'm so proud of what we've built and and the feedback that we've gotten.
So walk me through this for a minute. So let's look at it at 2 levels. One is the corporate level and the other is the individual level.
Right.
Let's start at the individual level. What's the advantage to me as an individual to go through this assessment, through the POWERS assessment, and get my results? I mean, because you and I both know that oftentimes people go through assessments and go, oh, I'm a 5 with a 3 wing, or I'm a this initial plus that initial.
Right.
And it becomes just another way to categorize oneself, and actually doesn't seem to do much for many people. And I realized that was part of the flaw that you went after. So talk to us about why I going through this test would go, this actually helps me, and here's how.
Sure. So, if somebody is coming across the POWERS and they're extraordinarily satisfied with where they are on their personal development, and they feel like they've got the perfect relationship with their spouse, and they've really got it nailed down in terms of work-life balance, and they can handle stress expertly, don't take it. Like, you don't need to spend the money, and it's not for you. But if a person feels out of balance, if you're listening to this and you've missed a kid's soccer game and because you had to work, and granted that sometimes happens, but if that's a habitual pattern, or you're feeling like that relationship with your significant other isn't right, what this is going to do is show you where you stand in all of these areas, and give you the roadmap you need to start making implementations in your life to change things. And so we have ways of doing that. We have premier content partners that can help somebody, once you know the roadmap, start improving that. And we have micro courses as well. We've built and continue to build out a system that allows everybody who takes this to start making transformational change. And again, you can't burn the candle at both ends. It only works so well if your work life is going exceptionally well, but your home life is going extremely poorly. There's only a matter of time before you can play that game, before that seeps into your work and your productivity, and vice versa.
Yes.
If you're unhappy at work, then it's impossible for that not to impact your relationship with your friends and your family. So we're giving you the blueprint to start making that transformational change if you're an individual taking this.
And as a company, what's the advantage for me putting my 50 or 50,000 people through this, aside from that they've got something to talk about at the water tower?
Right, and there's plenty to talk about at the water tower besides this.
Right.
The feedback we've gotten from a corporate standpoint has been phenomenal. And as I said, one of the high points of Powers is that it addresses things that other instruments out there don't address. That to get a good read on one's ability to understand nonverbal communication, to understand empathy. These are these aspects of emotional intelligence. And now it's interesting, the East, China is starting to get really excited about, because they realize they don't have it. To really understand from a leadership standpoint, what is one's ability to master vision and inventiveness, to be precise, to have confidence, to understand the importance of how diversity fits into the workplace today. And so what you're doing is you're not only giving HR directors this blueprint for building leaders and seeing where people fit, because if you know what their strengths are, then you want to put them into positions and build teams around the people who are most likely to help you succeed with that. Otherwise, you're kind of shooting in the dark. If you have somebody who lacks leadership abilities, then you don't want them as your team leader. And sometimes those things aren't as readily apparent as otherwise, in addition to the fact that you really, from a company standpoint, are getting a good idea of where they stand in a work-life equilibrium capacity, because a lot of times those people need EAP, or a lot of times those people just need a break. And the research, when I was interviewed by Glassdoor, I talked about that corporate America is really awakening to the ideas of these personal health days, and that we know that if we have a sense that an employee or a team member is kind of just hanging on by a thread, that we know that being able to help them recharge their batteries by taking that break, in the long run, they are far more productive and become a profit center rather than costing us because they're not productive at all, because they can't focus, because they're overwhelmed with stress. And so, for many companies who have a stress management system built in to their organization, this is a really valuable tool as well. So, it's the concert of these 21 dimensions altogether that are so exciting for corporations.
So what's the greatest misunderstanding about going through something like that? Because I think there is a lot of misunderstandings about these kinds of tools. What do you think? What would you say is the most common misunderstanding about it?
The most common misunderstanding about this industry is understanding how these things get developed and how they're really used. So I said I wasn't going to disparage the disc, but I think it is important to point out that an instrument like the disc, the research behind that, really kind of the seminal birth of the disc, 1928. And
it was to assess, it wasn't to assess how good or great you were, it was to assess how psychotic you were.
Yeah,
and wrong with you, not what was right with you.
Right. It's interesting too, right? Like if you think about the birth of the psychological assessment industry, what most people don't realize is that this came out of the military. And so, the original the original tests that were out there were called the Army Alpha 1 and the Army Alpha 2, which were simply designed to figure out what task they should assign a soldier into. Should this person be, a sergeant? Should this person be an MP? Should this person, that's what they were for. And so they've kind of evolved over time. But again, it's important to understand the research that goes into these things. It's important to understand how they're utilized. We have people that utilize powers as a pre-employment screening tool. We have consultants who use it to develop teams. We train HR directors so that they can understand how to implement this with their managers and middle managers. So there's an understanding that a tool is just a tool, right? A screwdriver is just a screwdriver without knowing how to use it. And so it's really important, whatever instrument you're using, not only to understand how to use it, but to understand how to implement it within your organization and be able to adopt the information that you're learning to fit the culture and the mission and the values of that organization. I think that's the most important thing, because if you're not doing that, you're just wasting money.
Now we're coming close to the end of the show, and I want to go into a lightning round. But before I do, we've been talking a lot about powers. Why don't you just tell people, before anything else, how they can tap into this, where they can go to find out about these assessments and potentially have their company do this, adopt this, or even as individuals?
Sure. So the best way to get at this is to go to the website seekyourpowers.com. And again, that's seekyourpowers.com. And you can use the code DoveBaron, all one word, lowercase or caps, surprise us, it doesn't matter. And we've got some different guides that we have available that you'll be able to pick that I'm going to give away to your audience as well, such as finding one's dream job. And we've got some other micro courses that you'll be able to pick from. But seekyourpowers.com is where you can find everything about powers assessment.
Fantastic. Well, we'll make sure that of course, goes into the show notes. However, let's go into our lightning round. Are you ready to go?
Fire away. Let's do this.
What are you presently most curious about?
I'm presently most curious about what is going to happen when we launch our newest tool, which is a high school football sports-specific version of the powers. We've been spending a lot of time on that. So I'm really curious to see what the feedback's going to be. We've been beta testing it with some local high school football teams, but really excited to see what that's going to look like and how we can help kids.
Very cool. What makes Dr. Richard cry?
Cry happy or cry sad?
Nope, not happy. We'll get to that one.
Okay. That's a really tough question. I don't cry a lot, but when I think about historically, when I have cried, it's been when somebody very close to me, a friend or family, is in pain, and particularly if I'm not able to help them. So I've always kind of been like the Rock, my not like the wrestler, the Rock. My family has always referred to me as the Rock that kind of holds the glue together when times are extremely tough. And so, and it's not like I'm bawling in tears, but certainly, any pain that comes to my wife or children probably would be the first thing that would make me cry, like severe pain.
What makes you cry happy? What makes you cry with joy?
Crying with joy is just knowing that I'm living my life in a way every day that is on mission. And a really fast story with this, I know we're in lightning round, but I think it's a good one to say. I had a kid reach out to me once through my podcast, a young man in his early 20s who was on the verge of committing suicide. In fact, he was getting ready to compose a suicide tweet and had gotten a gun and was going to kill himself. And then I popped up, an interview I did on another show on Entrepreneur on Fire popped up, and he heard that and he put his gun down and we listened to it all night, and then reached out to me and he said he not only did my show help him realize he no longer wanted to die, but he wanted to start a podcast for people with severe mental illness so that they can learn that there's a light at the end of the tunnel. And
Wow.
I helped him launch that, and now he's really successful and his life has totally changed. So that was probably the last time I actually cried, and I was really just overwhelmed with happiness, because no matter what else happens to me, like what in the world, what the hell can top that?
That's
so
a pretty good legacy on its own.
yeah, I mean, I didn't create my show to save a life, but it did. And just, having the honor, and I reached back out to him, of course. He gave me his number, and I was just so overwhelmed by that experience. So I think that was probably the most pointed example of me crying with joy.
Thank you. You and I have a background with psychology. We understand that there is no there. So, and I encourage the leaders that I work with and the ones who tune in to understand that it's an ongoing journey. What has been the most difficult inner demon you've had to battle?
I think fear, and I've said this a couple times, and what my fear lessons have taught me is that the imagined fear is always worse than the thing itself. Mm-hmm. And so that was my biggest demon. And I had a mentor talk to me once about, and when I was working on my doctoral dissertation, like that was that was such an overwhelming and stress-provoking thing for me, as it is for anybody who's gone through that. And she just said, you have to think about it like you're climbing a mountain, and it's one step at a time. And so that was really great advice for me. But it has always been fear, and even now, like I'll sometimes catch myself, and
of course,
you have to tell yourself that the fear of whatever you're afraid of is always going to be worse than whatever the reality is, and also then as an accompanying statement to that, knowing that you possess either the skills to deal with the fear is, or the resources within your network to find a solution if you don't have it on your own.
Indeed. So as we finish up, please share with our audience, I want from you one piece of practical advice that you're going to guide people to go do, preferably right away, but certainly within the next 24 to 48 hours, so they can really embody what it is you've been talking about.
If you have not jumped on our #MyDailyHelping movement, I encourage you to do that today. And you can do this in a number of ways, and it doesn't necessarily mean that you're just buying flowers for the receptionist in your place of work, but try doing something nice for somebody else. I tell people, something simple: buy somebody coffee at Starbucks who's in line behind you, or get somebody's groceries, or just help somebody across the street. When you start doing these things, particularly if you're not in the habit of being really conscious about helping somebody else while you're not expecting anything in return, sit with what that feels like, because I promise you, it's going to feel good and awaken something in you if you're not in the habit of doing this, that you're going to want to be a part of your day every day.
That's awesome. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Well, as you said, people can find you at seekyourpowers.com. You can also find Dr. Richard at drrichardshuster.com, thedailyhelping.com, and everykidrocks.org. So there's all kinds of ways. And as Dr. Richard said, you can also, you can do the #MyDailyHelping. I want to thank you for being with us today, my friend. It was a pleasure and an honor. Always a joy to talk to you. And I hope you'll stay with us to the end. Is there one last thing you want to say before we say goodbye?
This has been awesome. Thanks so much for having me on, and let's do this again sometime. This was great.
Wonderful. Thank you. And for you, dear listener, remember you can hang out with other conscious leaders and chat about this episode or any past episodes by going on Facebook and looking for the Leadership and Loyalty podcast. To find out how you can hire me, Dov Barron, as your speaker or strategist for your organization, you can simply go to FullMontyLeadership.com/consulting or FullMontyLeadership.com/speaking. And be aware that the research consistently shows that even the fastest growing companies face exactly the same challenge you do. They're spending a fortune on training and developing and attracting their top talent, only have them leave at an alarming rate. If you're frustrated with investing in training your top talent, only have them leave before you get your ROI, then come talk to us at FullMontyLeadership.com, where we provide the essential leadership skills to rekindle and amplify the hidden loyalty assets inside of your organization by tapping into purpose. FullMontyLeadership.com, because you can't outsource authenticity. I want to thank you for sharing the show with everyone you know. Until next time, stay curious, my friend. Stay curious. about your daily helping, how you can create a daily helping of kindness today. Lift the world, create a legacy. I'm Dov Baron. I'm here to assist you tapping into your deep greatness to reach the next level of clarity, focus, purpose, and profit in your business, your life, and your leadership impact. And I am out.